everyone, welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Monday, the 11th of December. And as you've probably noticed, I am just about caught up with the class discussion form questions. So I encourage you to read my responses, both to your responses and to your classmates' responses. That might help you with, let's say, a final exam or a paper number 2, which I will talk about shortly. But first, I wanted to put some closure onto The Exorcist. One of the ways of thinking about The Exorcist is that it's a reflection of some of the anxieties of its time. And the 1970s definitely was a time of lots of turmoil, drug use and abuse, where adults were looking at drugged youths and thinking that they were acting as if they were, well, possessed. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to think about The Exorcist from that lens, especially when we've got Kinderman talking about youths using LSD, being responsible for some of the problems in society. Kinderman being a kinder man. Ultimately, he decides not to pursue his investigations against Reagan. We know that Engstrom's character is further developed in the novel than it is in the movie, and that his story is about his drug-addled daughter. And we know, too, that at one point when Chris is seeking medical attention, doctors inquire whether or not she's keeping drugs in the house that Reagan might have consumed. We know that Reagan also is presented as the other or bestial. One of the messages within the novel is to at least act with love and compassion to that which is other or bestial, even if one doesn't necessarily feel that love or compassion. We know that also these characters are haunted by their own inner demons. And it's one of the best ways, I think, of thinking about The Exorcist, especially when we consider the title, because the story really is less about Reagan and more about Father Karras and Father Merrin. Although we could say that all of the characters in the book are haunted by their own kinds of demons. And of course, one of the things that the demon is able to do is to taunt Karras with doubt, because Karras's major demon is that he has a loss of faith, particularly when confronted with the poverty that his mother is stricken with when he's surrounded with so much comfort and privilege at Georgetown University, one of the best universities in the United States, perhaps in the world. And of course, we know that individuals like Chris MacNeil live nearby, a very affluent community. And Chris's affluence is in direct contrast to the poverty of not only Karras's mother, but even Karras. I guess there's a level of gradation there. And paper number 2, which is my segue, which would be due by the 18th on Monday, which is the very last day that you can hand it in, by the way, because that is the date in which I will be posting the final exam. But paper number 2 is similar to paper number 1 in that you are going to be asked to relate the Emily Dickinson quote that one need not be a chamber to be haunted to one of the later texts of the semester. And some texts lend themselves more to that topic than others. Certainly something like The Exorcist lends itself very well, because I think Karras is very much haunted by his inner demons, as is Father Merrin. Not very much discussed in the film, but definitely more developed in the novel, which is usually the case, about how he's decided to live a rather sheltered life away from the bestial and other that is a part of ministering to the poor. Instead, Merrin has chosen an academic life. And of course, we could say Chris MacNeil is haunted, of course, with her own guilt and her own issues. and the fact that ultimately Chris is a single mother in a time when divorce was still out of the ordinary, and the fact that ultimately Chris's career comes before her family, so much so that Reagan has needed to relocate and basically is surrounded completely by adults when her mother is on a film shoot, I think is quite relevant. But we think about other texts as well. Take something like The Haunting, and definitely Ellie is haunted. She's haunted by her past, and we can even say that someone like Dr. Markwell is haunted by the fact that he isn't given respect within the academic community. And even we could say the same with Theo, in that the reason why Theo was there is because she's had a falling out with her romantic partner. There is a rather flirtatious episode between Theo and Nell, and that episode, I think, very much is a hint that what we've got there is the possibility of queer relationship, with certainly Nell not being able to acknowledge that. And Theo talks about her partner, but she never identifies the specifics of her relationship. But it's general enough, considering the time period, that we can assume that it is a queer relationship. But even texts like, let's say, something like Lovecraft or Dracula, I think can lend themselves to the idea of one need not being a chamber to be haunted. I think about some of Lovecraft texts like The Other, that obviously the narrator is haunted by his own realizations that he's dead and is no longer part of the human world. He has literally become an outsider, the alien, the bestial, the other. And I think about something like the Dunwich Horror, where ultimately you've got the Whately family that are also haunted by isolationism and basically the consequences of that. And even something like Pickman's Model. Pickman, the narrator, is definitely haunted by Pickman's artwork. So even Dracula, I think perhaps less so about specific characters, and more so just about its commentary on its time period, the repressive Victorian period, which was probably haunted by its sexual curiosity and urges that couldn't necessarily come to realization. So instead, it had to be embedded in texts like Dracula. So, regardless, you do have the option of creating your own topic. You just need to have the topic approved by me. So, we're at the point of the semester where I'm going to ask you for your next attendance question, is if you have any questions about paper number 2, and if so, what are those questions? And if you don't have any questions, just feel free to say you don't have any questions, and that will suffice. While at this point, I've done the discussion forum responses for everything except for The Exorcist, which I will be doing shortly, particularly in the event that you think you might want to write about The Exorcist. And keep in mind that there is a final exam. The final exam will be posted on Monday the 18th, which is technically the ending of the semester, at 8 a.m., which is when we would normally be meeting if we were meeting in a face-to-face class. If we were meeting in a face-to-face class, you would have approximately 2 hours to take that final. Instead, what I will do is give you 24 hours to take that final so that you return it back by the 19th at 8 a.m. And in effect, it's going to be an essay exam where I'm going to give you a series of prompts and have you choose within that. Open book, open notes. So you can utilize things like class discussion forum responses and class videos, and certainly the text and your former writing. So I don't expect anything as neat or as well written or as polished as what you would do with the paper, but certainly you should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and should be able to synthesize some of the major points that we've talked about over the course of the semester. So the idea is that you would hand in the paper, and then you could focus on the final exam. And while you have 24 hours, I wouldn't anticipate that you should spend longer than 2-ish or so hours on that exam. So our last class is next class, because I wanted to end this a little bit early, so that you could begin in earnest with your paper if you haven't already done so. And we're going to finish up by the way we began. We began with Stephen King, so we are going to end with Stephen King. Much like with Lovecraft, we started with him and I gave you some examples of his short stories. I've done something comparable with Stephen King. Stephen King is probably better known as a novel writer. His novels tend to be rather long, and I'm quite aware at this point in the semester that we don't have the time or the energy to be tackling a novel. I highly recommend The Shining, by the way, if you're looking for a good Stephen King novel. Just a wonderful text. If you've seen the movie, it also is a masterpiece, just in a different way. Creative liberties were taken, as we so oftentimes have talked about with movie adaptations. But I thought we could do instead Stephen King's short stories, and there are a collection of his short stories in a book entitled Night Shift. And luckily, I was able to find a link for that text. And you can see in the notes below that I've given you a link to the foreword. I'd like you to read the foreword, because very much like in Danse Macabre, it talks about some of his major impressions about the Gothic tradition. It also continues on and gives you the full text, but I was able to find the two short stories that we are going to read on separate links that would get you directly to those short stories if you prefer to do that, rather than having to go through the entire text to find them. The first is entitled Jerusalem's Lot, and the second is entitled One for the Road. And I can tell you that he took the short story Jerusalem's Lot, renamed it, and made it into one of his more famous novels called Salem's Lot. So if you know anything about Salem's Lot, you know it's about vampires. And now that we've read Dracula, I think you'll understand what Stephen King was trying to do, both with Jerusalem's Lot as well as One for the Road. And you can see that his writing style is very different than Lovecraft's. So next class, we'll talk a little bit about that and put closure to the semester. But again, at this point, your attendance question is, do you have any questions about paper number 2? And if so, what are those questions? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We'll continue on next class and put closure on the semester with Stephen King. Take care. Bye-bye.